Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host, Mitch. Glad to have you here. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we're all about Commander on a budget. So before today's episode starts, I just want to say a quick thank you to Wizards for sending me this free preview content. So today's episode's an episode of Spare Change. Basically, some of my episodes don't fit in any of my other playlists, so this is where they end up. The topics on these kinds of episodes vary pretty widely, but you probably know what this one's about because of that previous intro part. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. And while you're at it, subscribe and review our podcast as well. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all of their support. So my exclusive Commander preview card is Tayam Luminous Enigma. Tayam is a 3/3 legendary creature nightmare beast that costs 1 white, black, green. It says each other creature you control enters the battlefield with an additional vigilance counter on it. And by paying 3, you can remove 3 counters from among creatures you control and put the top 3 cards of your library into your graveyard, then return a permanent card with converted mana cost of 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So this Abzan commander has quite a bit going on with it, so let's break this down piece by piece. First off, Tayam is a nightmare beast, and nightmare is a creature type that we haven't really seen too often. In fact, at the time of this recording, there are only 34 creatures in Magic with the nightmare type. And no, for all you rules lawyers out there, that's not including changelings. Anyways, a 3/3 for 4 mana really isn't that great, but that really doesn't matter with this commander. 4 mana is pretty low to the ground for a commander, so it's definitely not going to be considered too expensive to play. Let's read through that first ability one more time. Each other creature you control enters the battlefield with an additional vigilance counter on it. Now there are a ton of different counter types in Magic. There are +1/+1 counters, -1/-1 counters, wish counters, and even feather counters out there, but vigilance counters have never been mentioned. Vigilance counters are part of a brand new type of mechanic which are called keyword counters. My apologies while I just read from something so I don't screw it up. Ikoria introduces keyword counters. Just as a +1/+1 counter gives the creature it's on +1/+1, these keyword counters give the permanent they're on the listed ability. For this group of counters, having more than one of the same counter provides no additional benefit. So basically, if a creature has a vigilance counter on it, it has vigilance. In my mind, that's pretty straightforward. And if a creature has more than one vigilance counter on it, it doesn't have double vigilance or triple vigilance, it's just regular vigilance still. So again, when Tayam's in play, each of your other creatures come into play with an additional vigilance counter on them. This is different than a commander that, say, has an Anthem effect that's similar. If you've got a commander that says other creatures you control have vigilance, that works in a similar way, but different. Essentially, when Tayam comes down, it's not going to give vigilance to any of your other creatures that are already in play. So in one way, that's a negative compared to an Anthem. But a positive compared to those Anthem-type commanders is that even if Tayam leaves play, those vigilance counters stay. So basically, if Tayam dies or leaves the battlefield, those creatures that have the vigilance counters on them still have vigilance. Now this new keyword counters mechanic is definitely very interesting, but the thing that makes this commander powerful is that second ability. So I'm going to break it down and read it one piece at a time. For 3 mana, you remove 3 counters from among creatures you control. So this works with any type of counter that's on your creatures. So obviously this works great in tandem with Tayam's triggered ability. Tayam's going to be giving vigilance counters to all your creatures that are coming into play. These vigilance counters, as well as other types of counters that you might be using in this deck, give you fuel for that ability. Next up, you put the top 3 cards of your library into your graveyard, then you return a permanent card with converted mana cost of 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So first off, you're milling yourself for 3. There are a ton of graveyard synergies with Abzan decks, so this can really play into those. But more importantly, by milling yourself for 3, you're giving yourself access to more cards to bring back. And you can bring back any one permanent card that has a converted mana cost of 3 or less. So that can be a creature, an artifact, an enchantment, a planeswalker, or even a land. So essentially it's a repeatable Sun Titan trigger. If you've got mana and you've got counters to remove from your creatures, you can keep doing this. In my mind, it's kind of like a Muldrotha meets a Sun Titan-ish. Kind of. Anyways, like Muldrotha, your graveyard essentially becomes an extra hand. Well, essentially just an extra hand for just permanents, not including instants and sorceries. In one other clarification compared to Muldrotha, with Tayam you can only get things back that have a converted mana cost of 3 or less. But of course, there are a ton of amazing things in Magic that you can get back with this. And again, if you choose to get a creature back, it's going to come into play with an additional vigilance counter on it. And that means that you basically need one less counter to activate Tayam again. Now obviously this is just my initial thoughts on this commander, and I have not seen it in action yet. But in my mind, this is a very powerful, value-centric commander. It can make your creatures more effective, and more importantly, it can help you utilize your graveyard as a resource. And with that ability being repeatable, there are definitely going to be a ton of card combinations that can go infinite with it. Again, just my initial take, so I'm sure there's going to be at least a few comments on how I'm extremely wrong, and that's okay. Now, Tayam is actually the only preview card that I'm able to preview today. The full deck will be previewed in the near future on a separate episode. That being said, I can still talk about some cards that I would consider when building around this commander. Now, you can definitely take this deck in a lot of different directions, but the one that I would probably take it in would be an aristocrat-style deck centered around taking advantage of removing certain types of counters and constantly recurring creatures. I would put a hard focus on mostly having permanents that cost 3 converted mana cost or less. So I wouldn't be running many instants or sorceries, and the vast majority of my cards would have a converted mana cost of 3 or less. So the first thing that came into my head when I saw this commander is the Undying Mechanic. Undying is a keyword ability that says when this creature dies, if it had no +1/+1 counters on it, return to the battlefield under its owner's control with a +1/+1 counter on it. So I'd be including creatures in this deck like Young Wolf, Butcher Ghoul, and Strangleroot Geist, which are each creatures that have a converted mana cost of less than 3 and they have Undying. The reason that Undying is very good in this deck is because basically you can use time to take that counter off. Essentially, if you've got some kind of a sacrifice out that's generating you value, you can sacrifice one of these creatures. They come right back into play with a +1/+1 counter on them and a vigilance counter from Tayam. So essentially that's 2 of the 3 counters accounted for that Tayam needs. You pay 3 and take those 2 counters off and 1 counter off from something else, and then you can get something else back. Essentially, these are self-recurring creatures that are really hard to kill, and they give you access to a ton of counters throughout the game. So of course, another mechanic that's very similar that works just as well in this deck is Persist. Persist is essentially Undying, but instead of +1/+1 counters, it's -1/-1 counters. So instead of coming back stronger, the creature comes back weaker, but again, that really doesn't matter. Again, self-recurring creatures that can provide a ton of counters provide a lot of value for Tayam. And something like Kitchen Finks takes it a step further because when it comes into play, we gain 2 life. So something like this can gain us a ton of life throughout the game. And as I mentioned before, there are probably a ton of infinite combos with this commander, so Kitchen Finks can essentially just gain us infinite life if it's part of that combo. So again, Persist and Undying are very valuable keywords with Tayam, so I'd pretty much be running every single creature that I could that has one of those that has a converted mana cost of 3 or less. Next up, let's talk about some other permanents that give us access to a ton of counters. Weaponcraft Enthusiast has Fabricate 2, so when it comes into play, we put 2 +1/+1 counters on it, or we create 2 1/1 servos. Essentially, with either option that we choose, we're going to be getting 3 counters out of this deal. But with an Aristocrat style deck, we're probably going to take those servo tokens. So again, with our commander in play, the Enthusiast, as well as those tokens, come into play with a Vigilance counter on them. So for 3 mana, we get 3 bodies, and we get 3 counters. The creature that can get us 3 counters in total is Administrative Obligation. It's got Afterlife too, so when it dies, we get 2 1/1 black and white spirit creature tokens with flying. So with this one, we don't get all those counters right away, but we get a ton of value after this one dies. And of course, we're going to be running plenty of sacrifice outlets to make sure that that can happen when we need it to. And that even makes a card like Promise of Bunray very valuable in this deck. It's an enchantment that says when a creature you control dies, sacrifice Promise of Bunray. If you do, create 4 1/1 color spirit creature tokens. Again, sacking one of our own creatures is no big deal for this deck. When that happens, we get 4 tokens, each of them comes into play with a Vigilance counter on them. And because this card has a converted mana cost of 3 or less, we can keep getting it back with Tayam. Now I mentioned sacrifice outlets, so let's go through a few of them. First up, there's Carrion Feeder, which is going to be great in this deck. It says sacrifice a creature, put a +1/+1 counter on Carrion Feeder. So it's a free sacrifice outlet that gets an extra counter on it when we sack something. And then Altar of Dementia can also come in really handy too. It says sacrifice a creature, target player puts a number of cards equal to the sacrifice creature's power from the top of their library into their graveyard. To start, we're going to be milling ourselves with this as well. Again, our graveyard is essentially a second hand with this deck, so the more cards we have in our graveyard, the better. But this can easily turn into a win condition when played in the right way. Again, if we've got an infinite combo going on and we can keep sacrificing a creature over and over again, we just mill our opponents out. But pretty much any free sacrifice outlet is going to be valuable in this deck, especially ones that are hard to destroy. So something like Fanatical Devotion is going to be great as well. It says sacrifice a creature, regenerate target creature. So this is a free sacrifice outlet on top of a great way to protect our key pieces, including our commander. With Tayam's ability costing mana on top of counters, this is also going to be important to focus on in the deck. So a sacrifice outlet like Ashnod's Altar can be huge for this deck. It says sacrifice a creature, add colorless to your mana pool. So just by sacrificing one creature, we're already 2/3 of the way there. And we're all the way there if we've got something like Hearthstone in play. It says activate abilities of creatures cost 1 less to activate. This effect can't reduce the amount of mana an ability cost to activate to less than 1 mana. So yes, this might help our opponents out a little bit, but it also makes Tayam's cost only cost 2 instead of 3. In combination, Ashnod's Altar and Hearthstone can easily go infinite with the right creatures in play. And Pitiless Plunder is also a great card for this deck, even though it doesn't have a converted mana cost of 3 or less. It says whenever another creature you control dies, create a colorless treasure artifact token with tap, sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. This can generate us an absurd amount of mana. It can also help us go infinite too. Some other mana sources for us to consider are Devoted Druid, Priest of Gix, and Cathodian. Devoted Druid can tap for a green, and we can put a -1/-1 counter on it to untap it. Again, Tayam's ability can help us really utilize this creature as well as those counters. And then when Priest of Gix comes into play, we get black, black, black. And the Cathodian says when it dies, add colorless, colorless, colorless. Coincidentally, Tayam's ability costs that 3 mana. Either of these can easily go infinite with the right setup and play. With a free sacrifice outlet, an Undying creature, or Persist creature, you're good to go. But like Persist and Undying creatures, we want some other easy ways for us to get counters. So we're going to be running things like Champion of Lambholt, Good Fortune Unicorn, and even something like Mortician Beetle. Champion of Lambholt says creatures with power less than Champion of Lambholt's power can't block creatures you control. And whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on Champion of Lambholt. Good Fortune Unicorn helps spread those counters around because it says whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. So with our commander, whenever a creature comes into play, it gets 2 counters instead of 1. And then Mortician Beetle says whenever a player sacrifices a creature, you may put a +1/+1 counter on Mortician Beetle. So now we get some extra value out of our creatures dying too. And of course, like Muldrotha, we can really abuse some permanents that we can sacrifice and recur. Spore Frog is a fantastic example of that since you can sack it to Fog for the turn. And then Pernicious Deed has pay X and sacrifice Pernicious Deed, destroy each artifact, creature, and enchantment with converted mana costs of X or less. And then Plague Boiler is somewhat similar but can also be utilized with counters. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, put a Plague counter on Plague Boiler. By paying 1 black green, you can put a Plague counter on Plague Boiler, or you can remove 1 from it. And then when Plague Boiler has 3 or more counters on it, sacrifice it if you do destroy all non-land permanents. But of course, with all this value going on, you need ways to finish your opponents off. So cards like Zulaport Cutthroat, Cruel Celebrant, or Corpse Knight can be great ways to drain all of your opponents out. With an Abzan Aristocrat style deck, you've got access to a ton of great effects. And again, these can drain your opponents out all over time, or if you're going infinite, it can drain them out all at once. Again, I think that Tayam is an extremely powerful and value-centric commander, and I think time will tell on how popular it becomes. I'm also sure that there are plenty of ways to build around it, and the way that I described is just one of the many ways. And with that, this show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So what are your thoughts on this brand new commander, Tayam Luminous Enigma? Did you like the direction that I took it, or would you take it in a completely different one? Again, a big thanks to Wizards for sending over this free preview content. And make sure you're following us on social media for more updates and sneak peeks on future episodes. Again, a huge thank you to my patrons who help make this show possible. I truly couldn't do any of this without your support. If you want to support this channel directly, consider becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There are even tiers where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. You can check out all the Patreon tiers and rewards at patreon.com/commandersquarters. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we're all about budget commander. So while you're at it, go ahead and check out some of our other types of episodes. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again and have a good one.